In the space between death and eternity, there exists a terror more profound than the grave itself. Imagine a soul suspended in darkness, denied the peace of whatever lies beyond, trapped in a state of agonizing awareness with no body to call home. This is not the gentle passing into light that we hope awaits us all. This is something far more desperate, far more hungry. This is the realm of the Dybbuk. Picture, if you will, the narrow streets of an Eastern European shtetl at twilight, where shadows pool like ink between weathered wooden houses. The year might be 1870 or 1910, or any cold evening when the wind carries more than just the scent of chimney smoke. Inside the synagogue, candles flicker with a restless energy, their flames bending away from drafts that seem to come from nowhere. The elders gather close, their voices dropping to whispers when certain topics arise. They speak of the dead who will not rest, of souls so consumed by unfinished earthly desires that they claw their way back into the world of the living through the only door still open to them, the body of another human being. This is not mere superstition born from ignorance. This is Jewish mysticism at its most unsettling, a belief system that has survived centuries precisely because generation after generation has witnessed something they cannot explain. The Dybbuk is no abstract concept debated in dusty theological texts. It is a malevolent presence that grandmothers warned their grandchildren about, that rabbis prepared rituals to combat, that entire communities organized themselves to prevent. What drives a soul to such violation? What unfinished business could be so consuming that a spirit would commit the ultimate invasion, hijacking another person's flesh, speaking through their mouth, moving their limbs like a puppeteer of the damned? These are the questions that will haunt our journey through the documented cases, the unexplained possessions, and the dark corridors of belief that still echo with the screams of the afflicted. Welcome to a world where death is not always the end, and where the living must sometimes fight for sovereignty over their own skin. In the hills of Safed, a small city perched high in the mountains of Galilee, something extraordinary was taking shape in the 16th century. Jewish mystics gathered in secret study houses, their candles burning through the night as they pored over ancient texts that promised to reveal the hidden architecture of creation itself. This was not the rational Judaism of law and ritual alone, but something darker, more ambitious. These scholars believed they could map the movements of souls across lifetimes, chart the pathways of divine energy flowing through invisible worlds, and most troubling of all, they claimed to understand what happened when a soul became so corrupted that even God himself turned away from it. At the center of this mystical revolution stood a figure who would reshape Jewish thinking about the spirit realm forever. Isaac Luria, known to his disciples as the Ri, the Lion, arrived in Safed around 1570. He was young, barely in his 30s, but those who studied with him spoke of his teachings with a mixture of reverence and fear. Luria taught that the universe was not simply God's creation, but the result of a cosmic catastrophe. Divine vessels had shattered, scattering sparks of holiness into the darkness of matter. Every action humans performed either elevated these sparks back toward heaven or imprisoned them further in the shells of impurity. And human souls themselves were caught in this cosmic drama, cycling through life after life in an endless process of refinement and repair. This concept, which Luria called Gilgul, or the rolling of souls, became foundational to understanding what the mystics termed Dybbuk. The word itself comes from a Hebrew root, meaning to cling or to cleave, and it described a spirit that attached itself to a living person with parasitic desperation. But to comprehend why such a thing would occur, one must first grasp the Kabbalistic view of death and afterlife, which bore little resemblance to the simple heaven and hell of popular imagination. According to Lurianic teaching, when a person died, their soul underwent a process of evaluation and purification. The righteous might ascend through celestial palaces toward union with the divine. Others would face the punishments of Gehenna, a place of spiritual cleansing described in texts as fire that burned the soul without consuming it, purging away the residue of sin. But this punishment was temporary, lasting no more than 12 months, after which even the wicked could be rehabilitated. Most souls, neither fully righteous nor irredeemably wicked, would return to Earth in new bodies, given fresh opportunities to fulfill the commandments they had neglected, to repair the damage they had caused, to complete what their previous lives had left unfinished. Gilgul was not simple reincarnation as other traditions understood it. The Kabbalists mapped intricate laws governing which souls might inhabit, which bodies, what sins required what specific corrections, how fragments of one soul might split across multiple lives, how several souls might even occupy a single body simultaneously to help one another toward redemption. Rabbi Chaim Vital, Luria's primary disciple, filled notebook after notebook with his master's teachings on these matters, creating texts that would guide and terrify Jewish communities for centuries to come. But within this system of cosmic justice and infinite second chances, there existed a horror that the mystics spoke of only in whispers. Some souls committed acts so vile, so fundamentally opposed to the divine order, that they were expelled from the cycle of Gilgul entirely. The gates of reincarnation slammed shut. The gates of Gehenna, where at least purification was possible, remained locked as well. These souls found themselves in a state the text called tzaddikim, the expelled ones, wandering in a void between worlds with no hope of redemption, no possibility of rest. The specific sins that could condemn a soul to this fate were meticulously catalogued by the rabbis. Murder was among them, particularly the murder of a fellow Jew. Sexual transgressions of the most severe kind, violations that the Torah declared worthy of death, could bar the soul from divine mercy. Suicide was perhaps the most certain path to becoming a wandering spirit, for the person had rejected the gift of life itself, had torn themselves from the world before their appointed time. Those who died under a ban of excommunication, cut off from the community of Israel, might find themselves cut off from the community of souls as well. But sin alone did not account for every Dybbuk. The mystics taught that the manner of death mattered as much as the manner of life. A young woman who died before her wedding day, her life's purpose unfulfilled. A scholar who took a sacred vow and perished before completing it. A merchant who swore an oath with God's name and left it broken at his death. These souls remained tethered to the physical world by threads of incompletion, unable to ascend because some essential task remained undone, some cosmic debt unpaid. Most vulnerable of all were those who died what the text called an unnatural death. Not merely murder, but any death that came before its time, that violated the natural order of years allotted to a human life. A young man killed in an accident, a woman dead in childbirth, a child taken by sudden illness. The Kabbalists believed that such souls, ripped from their bodies before their spiritual work was complete, might panic in the void between worlds, desperately seeking any vessel that could allow them to remain connected to physical existence. Rabbi Vital recorded case after case in his writings, documenting encounters his master had with these displaced spirits. A woman possessed by the soul of a man who had died while angry at his wife. A child inhabited by someone who had failed to recite the Shema prayer before death. A merchant whose body hosted the wandering spirit of a thief. In each case, Luria could see what others could not, could hear the separate voice of the invading soul, could determine what sin or catastrophe had condemned it to this liminal existence. The worldview that emerged from Safed and spread through Jewish communities across Europe and the Mediterranean painted reality as far more permeable than most moderns can imagine. The living and the dead occupied not separate realms, but adjacent ones, separated by barriers that were thin and easily breached. Every shadow might conceal a watching spirit. Every unexpected thought or urge might originate not from one's own mind, but from some external consciousness seeking entry. The body itself was understood not as a sealed fortress, but as a house with many doors and windows, vulnerable to invasion if not properly guarded. This vulnerability was not distributed equally. The texts were clear that certain people were more susceptible to Dybbuk possession than others. Women, particularly young unmarried women, appeared again and again in the case histories, perhaps because they were seen as more spiritually open, less protected by the armor of Torah study and ritual obligation that defended men. Those in states of spiritual weakness, mourners, the sick, people in the grip of strong emotion, all these were considered dangerously exposed. Sinners too created openings in their own defenses, each transgression weakening the boundaries of the self. Medieval Jewish communities organized their entire spiritual lives around the recognition of these dangers. Prayer was not merely worship, but protection, each blessing forming a shield against invisible threats. The mezuzah on the doorpost served as a guardian, keeping malicious spirits from following residents into their home. The regular rhythms of ritual, 3 daily prayers, blessings before and after every act, created a lattice of sanctity that hostile forces could not easily penetrate. But when these defenses failed, when a Dybbuk managed to force its way into a human host, only one kind of person had the knowledge and power to confront it. These were the tzaddikim, the righteous ones, individuals who had achieved such spiritual purity and mastery of esoteric knowledge that they could navigate the hidden worlds with authority. A tzaddik could see beyond the physical, could perceive the invading soul clinging to its victim, could communicate with it, interrogate it, learn what it wanted, and why it had come. The process of exorcism in this tradition was not the violent confrontation familiar from Christian practice, though it shared certain elements. The tzaddik would assemble a minyan, a quorum of 10 men, whose collective spiritual force could help contain the Dybbuk. He would question the possessing spirit, demanding to know its name, its sins, what kept it from the world to come. Often the Dybbuk would resist, speaking through the victim in voices that were not their own, revealing secrets that the possessed person could not possibly know, demonstrating knowledge of distant events, speaking in languages they had never learned. If the spirit could be convinced to leave peacefully, if some correction could be offered, some unfulfilled obligation completed on its behalf, it might depart willingly. The community might commit to saying Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, for the soul's elevation. They might fulfill a vow the person had left incomplete. They might perform acts of charity in the dead person's name. But if the Dybbuk refused to leave, if it clung to its victim with the desperation of one who knows that departure means facing the judgment it had been fleeing, then the tzaddik might resort to harsher measures. He might invoke the ban, threatening the spirit with even worse punishments if it did not depart. He might summon angels by their secret names, celestial forces that could tear the Dybbuk from its host. In the most extreme cases, he might order the spirit cast out through the small toe of the victim's foot, the only exit that would not kill them, a detail that appears with eerie consistency across centuries of possession accounts. What terrified people most about the Dybbuk was not simply that the dead could return, but what that return revealed about the structure of reality itself. If souls could be expelled from divine mercy, if the cosmos contained spaces of permanent exile where spirits wandered in eternal desperation, then the universe was not the ordered creation of a benevolent God, but something darker, colder, a place where certain forms of corruption could never be cleansed, where some mistakes could never be corrected, where the boundary between person and spirit was so fragile that identity itself could be invaded and overwritten. The scholars of Safed had opened a door in Jewish consciousness that could never be fully closed. Their intricate maps of the soul's journey created new categories of fear, new possibilities for spiritual disaster. And in the centuries that followed, as their teachings spread through study houses and synagogues across the diaspora, the Dybbuk evolved from theological concept into lived reality, from mystical theory into a terror that gripped entire communities and left its mark on bodies and minds in ways that still echo in the folklore and trauma of Jewish collective memory. The summer heat of 1571 hung heavy over the cobblestone streets of Safed, that ancient city perched in the mountains of Galilee, where mystics gathered to unlock the secrets of creation itself. On this particular day, beneath a canopy of embroidered silk that fluttered in the afternoon breeze, a wedding was about to transform from celebration into nightmare. The bride was a girl named Leah, barely 16 years old, whose family had arranged her marriage to a young scholar from a neighboring district. By all accounts, she was known for her gentle disposition and piety, the kind of girl who lowered her eyes when spoken to and who had never given her parents a moment's worry. Her wedding day should have been the pinnacle of joy, the moment when her entire community gathered to witness the joining of two families under the holy covenant of marriage. The ceremony had proceeded without incident. The blessings had been recited, the wine shared, the glass shattered beneath the groom's heel to remind all present of the destruction of the temple. As the sun began its descent toward the Mediterranean in the west, casting golden light across the assembled guests, the celebration moved into its next phase. Musicians tuned their instruments. Tables groaned under platters of food prepared over days by dozens of hands. The bride sat in her designated place, surrounded by women who sang traditional songs, their voices rising and falling in ancient melodies that had accompanied Jewish weddings for generations beyond counting. Then, without warning, everything changed. Leah's body went rigid in her chair. Her eyes, which moments before had been demurely focused on her lap, rolled back until only the whites showed. The women nearest to her gasped and reached out to steady her, assuming she had simply fainted from the overwhelming emotion of the day, from the heat, from the weight of the elaborate dress and the hours of preparation that had begun before dawn. But when Leah's eyes snapped back into focus, they held something that had not been there before. Something ancient and malevolent and utterly foreign to the sweet-natured girl who had entered the marriage canopy just hours earlier. The voice that emerged from her throat was not her own. It was deep and guttural, rough with the coarse accent of a man who had spent his life among the lowest elements of society. The voice barked out a laugh that silenced the musicians mid-note and caused the nearest women to stumble backward, their faces draining of color. What this voice said next would be remembered and recounted in Safed for generations to come. The spirit inhabiting Leah's body began to speak secrets. Intimate, terrible secrets about people in the crowd. It called out the baker by name and described in vulgar detail an affair he had been conducting with a widow 3 streets away. It turned Leah's head toward a respected merchant and revealed that he had been cheating his customers with weighted scales for years, skimming profits and hiding them from his business partners. One by one, the Dybbuk exposed the hidden shames of the wedding guests. Speaking in that crude, masculine voice that seemed impossibly wrong, coming from the delicate bride who sat rigid in her chair, her wedding dress now soaked with sweat. Despite the cooling evening air, panic rippled through the celebration. Women screamed and clutched at their children. Men shouted over each other, some demanding action, others calling for a physician, still others recognizing immediately that this was no ordinary malady. This was a possession. A Dybbuk had entered the pure vessel of an innocent bride on the very threshold of her new life. Word spread through Safed with the speed of wildfire on a dry hillside. Within an hour, the entire city knew what had happened. The celebration had dissolved into chaos, with guests fleeing the scene, some to spread the news, others simply to escape the suffocating atmosphere of supernatural dread that had settled over the wedding like a shroud. By the time night fell completely, one name was on everyone's lips. They needed Rabbi Isaac Luria. They called him the Lion. Already, at the age of 37, he was recognized as perhaps the greatest Kabbalistic master of the age, a man who could perceive souls, who spoke with Elijah the prophet in visions, who understood the hidden mechanics of creation itself. If anyone could save this poor bride from the demon that had seized control of her body, it was Rabbi Luria. They found him in his study, bent over ancient texts by candlelight. When the delegation burst in with their desperate plea, witnesses later reported that he did not seem surprised. Some claimed he had known about the possession even before they arrived to tell him, that he had already been preparing himself for the confrontation that lay ahead. Rabbi Luria arrived at the bride's house as midnight approached. Leah had been carried there by her father and brothers, still rigid, still speaking in that terrible voice that was not hers. The Dybbuk had continued its revelations, its curses, its crude commentary on everyone who came near. The girl's mother sat in a corner, rocking and weeping, unable to process what had become of her beloved daughter on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. The rabbi entered the room where they had placed Leah on a simple bed. He brought with him a small group of the most learned men in Safed mystics who had studied the deepest secrets of Kabbalah, who understood the architecture of the spiritual realm. They would serve as witnesses and assistants in the ritual that was about to unfold. What happened over the next 3 days would be documented by several of these witnesses, their accounts preserved in texts that still exist in archives and libraries today. The exorcism of the Safed bride became one of the most detailed and carefully recorded cases of Dybbuk possession in Jewish history. Rabbi Luria began not with force, but with questions. Speaking in a calm, measured voice that stood in stark contrast to the Dybbuk's crude bellowing, he interrogated the spirit. "Who are you? Why have you entered this innocent girl? What sins bind you to the earthly realm?" The Dybbuk resisted at first, hurling insults and obscenities at the rabbi, making Leah's body thrash against the restraints that had been necessary to keep her from harming herself. But Rabbi Luria was patient and persistent. He recited specific psalms, passages chosen for their power to compel truth from hidden sources. He invoked divine names known only to the most advanced practitioners of practical Kabbalah, names that carried the weight of creation itself. Gradually, painfully, the Dybbuk story emerged. The spirit identified itself as a man named Haim, who had died 2 years earlier in a neighboring town. In life, he had been a merchant of dubious character, a man who accumulated wealth through deception and exploitation. He had cheated widows out of their inheritances. He had loaned money at usurious rates and foreclosed on families when they could not repay. He had married and divorced 3 women, leaving each one destitute. When he died suddenly, choking on a piece of meat at a feast he had thrown to celebrate his latest business triumph, his soul found itself in a state of terrible suspension. The Dybbuk explained, in moments when Rabbi Luria's interrogation forced it to speak truth rather than curses, that it could not face the divine judgment that awaited. The weight of unrepented sin was too heavy. The accounting would be too severe. In its desperate search for escape, for somewhere to hide from the celestial court that weighed all souls after death, it had wandered as a restless spirit, seeking entry into the living world. Why this girl? Why Leah? Because, the Dybbuk admitted, she was pure and innocent, a soul untainted by major transgression. The paradox of possession was that the most corrupt spirits sought the most innocent vessels. They believed in their twisted logic that they could hide within goodness, that they could escape judgment by contaminating purity itself. The Dybbuk had waited and watched, and when Leah stood beneath the marriage canopy in a state of heightened spiritual openness, in that liminal moment between her old life and her new one, it had found its opportunity and seized control. Rabbi Luria's face, witnesses reported, showed both compassion and determination. He understood the Dybbuk's fear, the very human terror of facing consequences for a life badly lived. But he also understood that this possession was an abomination, a violation of the innocent that could not be permitted to continue. The exorcism intensified. The rabbi directed his assistants to form a circle around the bed. They began to chant specific combinations of Hebrew letters, permutations of divine names that created, according to Kabbalistic teaching, doorways in the fabric of reality itself. Rabbi Luria placed his hands on Leah's forehead and began the ritual of separation, commanding the Dybbuk to depart, offering it one final chance to face judgment with whatever dignity remained to it. The Dybbuk refused. It screamed that it would rather drag the girl down with it than face what awaited in the world beyond. It made Leah's body convulse with such violence that 2 of the men holding her restraints were thrown backward. Foam appeared at the corners of her mouth. Her skin took on an unnatural pallor, and her breathing became labored and irregular. This was the crisis point. The physical toll of the possession was becoming catastrophic. If the exorcism continued much longer, there was real danger that Leah's body would not survive the ordeal. But if it stopped now, the Dybbuk would remain, and the girl Rabbi Luria had known would be lost forever, buried beneath the personality of a dead merchant who refused to relinquish his stolen refuge. Rabbi Luria made his decision. He called for a minyan, 10 men, to be assembled. He instructed them in a specific prayer cycle that would continue without interruption for the next 12 hours. He himself would remain in direct confrontation with the Dybbuk, using techniques passed down through generations of mystical practitioners, methods for compelling spirits that went back to King Solomon himself. As the 3rd day of the exorcism dawned, everyone in that room was exhausted. The men chanting prayers had rotated in shifts, but Rabbi Luria had not rested. His voice had grown hoarse from hours of invocation and command. Leah's body had weakened visibly, her wedding dress now hanging loose on a frame that had shed dangerous amounts of weight in just 3 days. Finally, as morning light filtered through the window, Rabbi Luria employed his final stratagem. He commanded the Dybbuk, by the authority of the ineffable name of God, to depart through the smallest toe of Leah's left foot. This was an ancient technique, forcing the spirit to leave through an extremity, so that its exit would cause minimal damage to the possessed person's body and soul. The Dybbuk fought to the very last moment, But the combination of Rabbi Luria's expertise, the sustained prayer of the assembled men, and the sheer spiritual weight of the divine names being invoked finally broke its resistance. Witnesses reported that Leah's left foot jerked violently, and a sound like wind rushing through a narrow space filled the room. Some claimed to see a dark shadow emerge from her toe and dissipate like smoke in the morning air. Then Leah's body went completely limp. For several terrible heartbeats, those present feared she had died. But Rabbi Luria placed his hand on her chest and nodded. She was breathing, sleeping. The Dybbuk was gone. When Leah woke several hours later, she remembered nothing of the 3 days of possession. The last thing she recalled was sitting among the women at her wedding, feeling slightly dizzy from the heat. The physical recovery took weeks. The psychological recovery, for both Leah and her community, took far longer. The case became legendary, a cornerstone story in the tradition of Dybbuk possession. It illustrated the vulnerability of the innocent, the persistence required in spiritual warfare, and the necessity of mystics like Rabbi Luria, who possessed both the knowledge and the courage to confront forces that existed in the shadowy spaces between life and death. In Safed, they still tell the story of the bride whose wedding day became a battlefield, and the rabbi who fought for her soul and won. The weight of history pressed down hardest on those who had least to bear it. In the villages and towns scattered throughout the Pale of Settlement, where Jewish communities lived hemmed in by law and circumstance, there existed a particular kind of desperation. Here, in the late 1700s through the 1800s, in territories that today we know as parts of Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus, the Pale was never meant to be a home. It was a cage dressed up as policy, a vast border region where Russian authorities confined Jewish populations away from the Russian heartland. Within this restricted territory, life compressed into small wooden villages called shtetls, where families crowded into modest homes, where work was scarce and hunger common, where Cossack raids and pogroms could erupt without warning. The mud streets knew the footfalls of scholars and merchants, yes, but also of widows and orphans, of men broken by conscription laws that took their sons for 25 years of military service, of mothers who buried children they could not feed. In this atmosphere of perpetual uncertainty, the boundary between the living and the dead seemed dangerously thin. And when that boundary broke, when spirits of the departed forced their way back into the world of flesh, the rabbis who recorded these invasions used a specific term, Dybbuk, a clinging spirit, a soul so tortured, so wronged in life or death that it could not rest, could not move on, but instead seized hold of the living and spoke through borrowed mouths of crimes that demanded witness. The cases followed patterns, recurring motifs that appeared across decades and distances. Rabbinical records from the 1700s onward documented these possessions with a precision that reveals both belief and terror. The possessed were most often young women, though men suffered this fate too. The invading spirits identified themselves with remarkable consistency. They claimed to be victims of violence, souls who had died through murder or accident or injustice. They demanded that wrongs be righted, debts be paid, truths be spoken that the living had tried to bury. In the town of Kremenitz, in 1793, a woman named Riesel began speaking in her father's voice 3 years after his death. The family knew the voice, recognized its particular accent, its turns of phrase. Through Riesel's mouth, the father's spirit told of money owed to him by a prominent merchant, debts carefully concealed after his passing. The spirit provided details no one but the father and merchant could have known, naming sums and dates with accounting precision. When confronted, the merchant initially denied everything, but the community had heard the Dybbuk speak. They had watched this young woman, who had no head for numbers, recite figures and interest calculations she had never learned. Under mounting pressure, the merchant eventually admitted the debt and made restitution to the family. Only then did the spirit release its grip on Riesel. This pattern of hidden knowledge appeared again and again in the records. In 1821, near Vitebsk, a boy of 13 suddenly began speaking in the voice of a woman, high and keening. The Dybbuk identified itself as the spirit of a woman murdered 5 years prior, her body hidden in a well on the outskirts of town. The boy, who had been elsewhere when the woman disappeared, led authorities to the exact well. They found her remains where the spirit said they would be, down to describing the pattern on the dress in which she had been buried. The case remained in rabbinical correspondence for years, cited as evidence of how the dead could use the living to expose crimes hidden from earthly justice. The gender-crossing voices particularly unsettled communities. When women spoke in men's voices, when men spoke in women's voices, it violated natural order in a way that seemed to confirm supernatural invasion. In the shtetl of Zamosk, witnesses recorded how a young bride, barely married 2 months, suddenly began speaking in a deep bass voice, cursing in Polish and Ukrainian, though she herself spoke only Yiddish. The Dybbuk claimed to be a soldier who had died in a tavern brawl, his death unavenged because witnesses had lied about what happened. Through the young woman, the soldier named his killer, described the weapon, detailed the argument that had escalated into murder. The killer had long since left the town, but the Dybbuk's testimony traveled, carried by those who had witnessed the possession. Justice in such cases became complicated, tangled between earthly law and spiritual imperative. The physical symptoms terrified those who witnessed them. Rabbinical records documented convulsions that could last for hours, the possessed body contorting in ways that seemed impossible without broken bones. In 1837, Rabbi Yechiel Mishal of Slutsk recorded the case of a Torah scribe named Avram, who suddenly fell during evening prayers, his body rigid as stone. When he finally moved again, it was with violent shaking, his hands scratching at his throat as if trying to tear something free. The voice that emerged was not his own, but that of a woman claiming to have been strangled by her husband. For 3 days, Avram's body served as vessel for her testimony. He refused food, speaking only in her voice, demanding that her murderer confess. The physical toll was severe. Witnesses reported that Avram displayed strength far beyond his normal capacity, requiring 4 men to hold him down during the worst convulsions. His wife later testified that she did not recognize the man thrashing in their bed, that his eyes looked through her as if she were made of glass. The language phenomenon particularly struck rabbinical observers as evidence of genuine possession. The afflicted spoke in tongues they had never studied, dialects they had never heard. A blacksmith's daughter in Berdichev suddenly spoke fluent Aramaic, reciting Talmudic passages she had never been taught. Jewish law prohibited women from advanced religious study, yet here she quoted obscure commentaries, arguing fine points of law in a scholar's voice. The Dybbuk claimed to be a rabbi who had died with the question unresolved, a legal matter that troubled his soul. Through the young woman, the dead scholar debated with the living until they reached consensus on the interpretation. Only when the community agreed with his position did the spirit depart. These cases created concentric circles of trauma, rippling through already fragile communities. A possession did not happen in private. It erupted in the middle of daily life, in the marketplace or the synagogue or the family home. Neighbors gathered, whispers spread, fear multiplied. If a Dybbuk could seize Rizal or Avram, whose body was safe, the possessions often occurred after communal trauma, after a particular brutal raid or a wave of forced conscriptions. In 1864, following a pogrom in Mogilev that left 17 dead and dozens homeless, 3 separate possession cases erupted within 2 months. Each Dybbuk claimed to be one of the murdered. Each spoke of the violence in detail. Each demanded that the stories be remembered, be recorded, be preserved. The psychological weight this placed on communities already living under persecution cannot be overstated. These were people who endured discriminatory laws limiting where they could live, what trades they could practice, which schools their children could attend. They faced quotas and restrictions, taxes specifically targeting their communities, periodic expulsions and confiscation. Violence could arrive without warning, sanctioned, or simply ignored by authorities. Within this context of systemic oppression, the Dybbuk phenomenon served multiple functions. It gave voice to the voiceless dead. It forced acknowledgement of crimes that would otherwise go unpunished. It created a spiritual justice system where earthly justice had failed. But it also deepened the sense that nowhere was safe, not even one's own body. The Dybbuk spoke of wrongs that could not be righted through normal channels, deaths that had left souls in torment. They revealed a cosmic order where injustice had consequences beyond the grave, where the murdered could return to name their killers, where debts unpaid in life became spiritual chains in death. For communities already traumatized, this added another layer of fear. The possessed suffered, certainly, but so did everyone who witnessed them. Everyone who recognized that the boundary between self and other could dissolve, that a person could become a vessel for another's agony. The rabbinical authorities who documented these cases walked a difficult line. They needed to distinguish genuine possession from fraud or illness, to determine when an exorcism was necessary, and when other interventions might serve. Their records show systematic investigation. They questioned the possessed about facts only the claimed Dybbuk could know. They tested the manifestations of superhuman strength, the accuracy of revealed secrets, the authenticity of unknown languages. They brought in multiple witnesses, compared testimonies, looked for internal contradictions. Yet even skeptical rabbis found cases they could not explain away. When every test confirmed what seemed impossible, when the possessed demonstrated knowledge they could not naturally possess, when physical symptoms exceeded medical explanation, the rabbinical courts concluded that spiritual invasion had occurred. They prescribed rituals of exorcism, complex ceremonies involving prayers and commands, holy names and spiritual authority, attempting to compel the Dybbuk to depart. These possessions were not abstract theological debates. They were human crises, personal catastrophes playing out in communities with few resources to address them. The possessed often suffered permanent damage. Some never fully recovered their health. Others lived under suspicion afterward, marked by what had inhabited them. Families bore the stigma, the whispered questions about what sin might have invited such invasion. The shtetls of the Pale of Settlement have largely vanished now, destroyed by pogroms and wars, depopulated by emigration and genocide. But the records remain, testimony preserved in rabbinical responsa and community archives. They speak of a world where trauma compounded trauma, where the dead could not rest because the living had no peace, where possession became the language through which unbearable truths forced themselves to be heard. The wine cabinet sat among the mundane remnants of a life ended, just another piece of furniture waiting for someone to carry it home. But this was no ordinary cabinet. In the late summer of 2001, in Portland, Oregon, an estate sale would become the starting point of what many consider the most documented case of a cursed object in modern history. The woman selling the cabinet explained its origin with visible discomfort. It had belonged to her grandmother, a Holocaust survivor who had escaped from Poland and brought very few possessions to America. Among those precious items was this wine cabinet, referred to in hushed Yiddish as a Dybbuk Box. The granddaughter made an unusual request to the potential buyers. She asked, almost pleaded, that the box never be opened. Her grandmother, she explained, had kept it sealed, hidden away, speaking of it only in whispers and warnings. When pressed for details, the young woman would only say that something had been trapped inside, something that her grandmother feared above all else. Kevin Manis, a furniture refinisher and shop owner, purchased the cabinet for $45. He thought it would make an interesting gift for his mother. The granddaughter's relief at selling it was palpable, but so was her anxiety. As Manis loaded the cabinet into his vehicle, he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman seemed more concerned with getting rid of it than with making money. This nagging observation would haunt him in the days to come. The first incident occurred within hours. Manis brought the cabinet to his shop and left it in the basement workspace while he attended to other business. When he returned, he found his employee sitting on the ground outside, visibly shaken and refusing to go back inside. She described hearing sounds coming from the basement, sounds like glass breaking and cursing, though no one else was in the building. When Manis investigated, he found every light bulb in the shop shattered. Not burned out, not broken from obvious impact. Shattered from within, with the filaments intact, as if something had caused them to explode from internal pressure. He decided against giving the cabinet to his mother. Instead, he examined it more carefully. The box itself measured roughly 12 inches tall, 13 inches wide, and over 20 inches deep. Made of wood with brass and glass accents, it appeared to be of European Jewish origin, likely from the early 1900s. When Manis finally opened it, he discovered the contents the grandmother had sealed away. Inside, arranged with deliberate care, lay several objects. 2 locks of hair, 1 blonde and 1 dark brown, each bound with cord, a dried rosebud, a single golden wine goblet, 2 wheat pennies from the 1920s, a small granite slab with the Hebrew word shalom engraved into its surface, an ornate candlestick, and most disturbing of all, a cast iron candle holder with an octopus-like base. These items weren't randomly thrown into storage. They had been placed intentionally, ritually, as if they served a specific purpose in containing something. Despite his misgivings, Manis still wanted to give his mother a gift. On her birthday, in October of 2001, he presented her with the wine cabinet, explaining it was an antique from Europe. His mother's reaction was immediate and violent. Upon touching the box, she suffered a massive stroke. When she regained limited ability to communicate, she spelled out a message using an alphabet board. The same message repeated with increasing desperation. No gift. Manis took the cabinet back. That night, he experienced the first of what would become a recurring nightmare. In the dream, an old woman appeared. She had long, stringy hair and eyes that held nothing but malice. She would approach him slowly, never speaking, and when she got close enough, she would begin beating him. The details were always the same. The smell of jasmine mixed with cat urine. The sound of her breathing, raspy and wet. The feeling of her strikes, which somehow hurt in the dream as much as real blows would in waking life. He would wake up gasping, the smell still lingering in his bedroom. Desperate to be rid of the object, Manis gave the cabinet to his sister. She kept it for 3 days before returning it, furious and terrified. She reported the same nightmare. The same old woman. The same smells. The same sense of being attacked in her sleep. She also mentioned that her hair had begun falling out in clumps, and a rash had appeared on her arms that formed strange patterns, almost like symbols. Manis next offered it to his brother. The brother lasted less than a week. He returned the cabinet with a report that added new dimensions to the horror. Doors in his home would open and close on their own. The smell of jasmine and cat urine would appear suddenly, impossibly strong, then vanish just as quickly. He woke one night to find the cabinet doors open, though he had closed them before bed. The objects inside had been rearranged. A girlfriend took the cabinet, thinking the stories were exaggerated. She called Manis after 4 days, begging him to take it back. She had woken up with bruises on her legs and arms, bruises that looked like handprints. The nightmares had started immediately. The old woman, she said, was showing her things. Horrible things. Images of suffering and death, presented as if the entity wanted her to understand what it had experienced or caused. Manis tried selling the cabinet multiple times at his antique shop, but it kept coming back. Buyers would return it within days, sometimes hours, always with similar stories. The nightmares, the smells, the feeling of being watched, electrical disturbances, unexplained illnesses. One customer reported that every mirror in her home cracked the night she brought the cabinet inside. Another claimed to have seen shadowy figures moving inside the cabinet's glass doors, even though nothing should have been there. In desperation, Manis buried the box in his backyard. 3 nights later, he began receiving phone calls. No one spoke on the other end, but he could hear breathing and faintly what sounded like someone crying. When he dug up the cabinet, he found the dirt around it had formed a perfect circle, as if something had drawn a boundary around the burial spot. Understanding he couldn't destroy it and couldn't keep it, Manis decided to sell it with full disclosure. In 2003, he listed the Dybbuk Box on an online auction site, including every detail of his experiences. He wrote extensively about the nightmares, the health problems, the phenomena that seemed to follow the object wherever it went. He expected this transparency would prevent any sale. Instead, it guaranteed one. Iosif Nietzsche purchased the box for $280. A college student fascinated by paranormal phenomena, Nietzsche thought he could handle whatever came with the cabinet. He documented his experiences extensively, creating the first detailed written record of the box's effects. Within days of receiving it, Nietzsche began experiencing severe health problems. His hair started falling out at an alarming rate, a pattern now familiar from previous owners. He developed hives and welts that doctors couldn't explain. He coughed up blood, though medical examinations revealed no source for the bleeding. The nightmares intensified for Nietzsche. The old woman appeared nightly, but she began speaking in his dreams, though he couldn't understand the language. He researched the words he could remember and believed they were Yiddish curses. Objects in his dorm room would move. He would place something on his desk and find it across the room moments later. His roommate refused to stay in their room after witnessing books flying off shelves. Most disturbing were the shadow figures. Nietzsche reported seeing them in his peripheral vision, dark forms that would stand in corners or doorways. When he turned to look directly at them, they would vanish, but he could feel them watching. He set up a camera to record his room at night and captured what appeared to be unexplained movements and shadow anomalies, though skeptics argued the footage was inconclusive. After several months of deteriorating health and escalating phenomena, Nietzsche sold the box. It passed through multiple owners over the next few years, each adding their own chapter to the cabinet's dark history. A pattern emerged. New owners would initially be skeptical, then fascinated, then terrified. The timeline was remarkably consistent. Within 48 hours, the nightmares would begin. Within a week, physical health problems would manifest. Within 2 weeks, most owners were desperate to be rid of the object. The phenomena associated with the box seemed to evolve. Later owners reported electronics malfunctioning in its presence. Smartphones would die despite full batteries. Computers would crash or display strange error messages. Security systems would trigger without cause. Some reported that photographs taken near the box would develop strange artifacts, orbs of light or shadow figures that weren't visible to the naked eye. In 2004, Jason Haxton, the director of the Museum of Osteopathic Medicine in Missouri, acquired the Dybbuk Box. Well, unlike previous owners who stumbled into possession, Haxton approached the object with academic curiosity and methodical documentation. He researched the history of Dybbuks in Jewish folklore, consulted with rabbis and scholars, and attempted to understand what he had obtained. Haxton's experiences followed the established pattern, but with additional elements. He developed strange eye problems, suffering from hives that appeared on his eyelids. He experienced difficulty breathing, waking in the night feeling as though someone was sitting on his chest. The smell of jasmine and cat urine became a constant presence in his home. His health deteriorated to the point that doctors became genuinely concerned, though they could find no medical explanation for his symptoms. What made Haxton's ownership significant was his determination to research and potentially neutralize the box's effect. He consulted with Kabbalistic experts who explained the traditional Jewish belief in Dybbuks. In Jewish folklore, a Dybbuk is the malicious spirit of a deceased person that attaches itself to or possesses a living being. The word itself comes from the Hebrew term meaning to cling or to cleave. Historically, Dybbuks were thought to be souls barred from entering heaven due to their sins in life, wandering until they could find a host to inhabit. The ritual objects found inside the box began to make sense within this context. The locks of hair, the candlestick, the granite slab with its Hebrew inscription. These items suggested that someone, likely the original owner, had performed a ritual to trap or contain something. Whether they were sealing away a Dybbuk or attempting to create a protective amulet against one remains unclear. The specific combination of items suggested knowledge of Kabbalistic practices, the mystical tradition within Judaism that deals with the nature of divinity, the soul, and the unseen world. Haxton eventually consulted with rabbis who performed a cleansing ritual. He had a gold-plated case constructed to contain the cabinet, following specifications that incorporated traditional Jewish protective symbol. Some believe this provided relief. Others note that Haxton's health issues persisted in various forms. The box now resides in Haxton's museum, sealed in its gold case, still containing the original ritual objects. The Dybbuk Box case raises profound questions about the nature of cursed objects and belief itself. Skeptics point to several alternative explanations. Power of suggestion could account for much of the phenomena. Once someone knows an object is supposedly cursed, they become hyper-vigilant, attributing any negative event to the object's influence. The nightmares could be the result of anxiety and cultural imagery. The old woman figure appears in many traditions as a frightening entity. The physical symptoms might stem from stress, environmental factors unrelated to the box, or pre-existing conditions that coincidentally manifested during ownership. The consistent pattern of experiences among multiple owners, however, challenges pure skepticism. How do we explain the remarkable similarity in nightmares reported by people who had no contact with each other before purchasing the box? Why do the specific smells of jasmine and cat urine appear so frequently? What accounts for the electrical phenomena witnessed by multiple observers? Coincidence can explain isolated incidents, but when patterns repeat across dozens of owners over 2 decades, coincidence becomes a less satisfying answer. The Holocaust connection adds another layer of complexity and tragedy to the story. If the cabinet did belong to a Holocaust survivor, it carried the trauma of one of history's greatest horrors. Some researchers have suggested that objects can absorb emotional energy, particularly from intense trauma. Whether this represents a literal paranormal phenomenon or a psychological projection, the association of the Dybbuk Box with Holocaust history makes it an artifact of suffering, regardless of supernatural authenticity. The cabinet remains in its sealed case today, a testament to our complicated relationship with the unexplained. It represents the modern haunted object, something that exists at the intersection of verifiable history and reported phenomena that defies conventional explanation. Whether the Dybbuk Box contains an actual malevolent spirit, serves as a focal point for psychological projection, or exists as an elaborate fabrication, it has achieved one undeniable status. It has become the most famous cursed object of the 21st century, a reminder that even in our age of technology and scientific understanding, we still find ourselves confronted with things that resist easy explanation and inspire genuine fear. In the dim light of a synagogue chamber, 10 men gather in a circle around a writhing figure, their voices rising in prayer while the sharp blast of a ram's horn pierces the air. This is not a scene from medieval superstition, but a ritual that has persisted for centuries within Jewish mystical tradition, a spiritual technology designed to confront one of the most terrifying phenomena in Kabbalistic belief, the Dybbuk, a malicious spirit that has invaded and taken possession of a living human body. The Dybbuk exorcism represents one of the most elaborate and psychologically intense rituals in Jewish mysticism, a carefully orchestrated spiritual combat that follows precise rules laid out in texts like the 16th century work Shoav Ha'ari, and later Hasidic writing. Unlike the dramatic confrontations often depicted in popular culture, traditional Dybbuk exorcism is a methodical process that respects both the gravity of spiritual possession and the fragility of the human vessel caught in between worlds. Every step, every prayer, every sound serves a specific purpose in what believers understand as a literal battle for a human soul. The first requirement for a proper Dybbuk exorcism is the assembly of a minyan, the quorum of 10 Jewish men needed for certain prayers and ritual. This is not merely tradition for tradition's sake. According to Kabbalistic understanding, the minyan creates a spiritual container, a holy circuit of energy that provides protection for both the possessed individual and the exorcists who will confront the invading spirit. Each of these 10 men bears responsibility, their combined presence forming a barrier against spiritual contamination. In documented cases from 18th and 19th century Eastern Europe, eyewitnesses described how the men of the minyan would stand in specific positions around the afflicted person, creating geometric patterns that correspond to mystical diagrams found in Kabbalistic texts. The arrangement was never random. Each position related to one of the 10 Sephirot, the divine emanations that structure reality in Jewish mystical thought. The exorcist himself, typically a respected rabbi with deep knowledge of Kabbalah and lived experience in spiritual matters, would often fast for days before the ritual. Accounts from the Hasidic courts of Poland and Ukraine describe how these religious leaders would immerse themselves in ritual baths, recite specific psalms throughout the night, and engage in intense meditation. They understood that they were about to engage in combat with a force that could, if given opportunity, attach itself to any weakness or impurity it found. The rabbi was not merely performing a ceremony, but placing himself in genuine spiritual danger. Once the minyan is assembled and the possessed individual brought before them, the ritual begins with prayer. But these are not gentle supplications. The men recite psalms known for their protective and combative qualities, particularly Psalm 91, which speaks of dwelling in the shelter of the Most High and being protected from the terror of night and the arrow that flies by day. The words themselves are understood as weapons, each syllable a strike against the invading entity. Witnesses to historical exorcisms reported that during these prayers, the possessed would often display violent reactions, screaming in voices not their own, contorting their bodies in ways that seemed physically impossible, or speaking in languages they had never learned. Then comes the shofar, the ram's horn whose blast has signaled everything from divine revelation at Mount Sinai to the Jewish New Year. In the context of exorcism, the shofar serves a specific tactical purpose. According to mystical texts, the sound of the shofar weakens the Dybbuk's hold on its host. The blast is not merely loud noise, but a spiritual frequency that disrupts the connection between the possessing spirit and the physical body it has invaded. Kabbalistic theory explains that the shofar's sound carries the quality of divine breath, the same force that animated the first human being. When blown with proper intention and technique, it creates vibrations that shake loose the Dybbuk's grip. Historical accounts describe exorcists blowing the shofar in specific patterns, sometimes dozens of blasts in succession, with the possessed person's reactions intensifying with each sound. The Dybbuk would reportedly cry out in pain, beg for the blowing to stop, or attempt to negotiate. This was the moment when the spirit's hold began to weaken, when the interrogation could truly begin. The interrogation phase of the ritual reveals the psychological sophistication underlying these mystical practices. The exorcist demands that the Dybbuk identify itself, reveal its true name, and confess the sins that led to its current state. In Jewish mystical understanding, a Dybbuk is not a demon, but the soul of a deceased person who committed such grievous sins in life that it cannot find rest in death. Unable to face divine judgment, it wanders until finding a living person vulnerable enough to invade, often someone who has committed a similar sin or possesses a spiritual weakness that creates an opening. The demand for the Dybbuk's name is crucial. Names in Kabbalistic thought carry power and essence. By forcing the spirit to reveal its identity, the exorcist gains authority over it. This echoes patterns found across many spiritual traditions, but in Jewish practice, it connects to a long history of name mysticism, from Adam naming the animals to the secret names of God that form the basis of many Kabbalistic meditations. Witnesses to exorcisms recorded that the possessed would often resist this revelation with terrible struggle, the Dybbuk understanding that disclosure meant vulnerability. When the name finally came, it was sometimes that of a person known to the community, a deceased individual whose life and sins were remembered, adding a layer of social and psychological weight to the entire proceeding. Following the name, the exorcist demands a full confession of the sins that led to the soul's terrible fate. The Dybbuk must speak them aloud before the assembled minyan must admit to adultery, murder, theft, blasphemy, or whatever transgressions earned it this wandering punishment. This public confession serves multiple purposes. It satisfies the requirement of truth-telling that weakens the spirit's power. It provides cautionary instruction to the witnesses about the consequences of sin. And it begins the process of spiritual resolution that might, if the exorcist chooses mercy, allow the Dybbuk some eventual peace. But the exorcism is not yet complete. The Dybbuk must be forced to leave its host, and here the ritual demonstrates remarkable concern for the welfare of the possessed person. The exorcist commands the spirit to depart through the small toe of the left foot. This specific exit point is not arbitrary, but reflects deep concern about spiritual anatomy. Kabbalistic understanding holds that the soul permeates the entire body, but maintains particularly strong connections to certain areas. The head and heart are especially critical zones where the human soul resides most intensely. If the Dybbuk were forced out through the mouth, nostrils, eyes, or any opening in the upper body, it might tear or damage the host's own soul in its departure, potentially causing madness, permanent spiritual injury, or even death. The small toe represents the furthest extremity from these vital spiritual centers, a point where the Dybbuk can be expelled with minimal risk to the host. Accounts describe the exorcist making a small incision or puncture in the toe to provide a literal opening, while the prayers and shofar blasts intensify, driving the weakened spirit downward through the body toward this designated exit. The possessed person would often feel the sensation of something moving through their leg, would cry out at the moment of release, and witnesses claimed to sometimes see the toe blacken or a small amount of blood emerge as the spirit departed. But where does the Dybbuk go upon leaving? The ritual requires immediate containment. The exorcist would have prepared in advance a specific object to receive the departing spirit, often a ceramic vessel, a bottle, or in some traditions, a black chicken held near the toe at the moment of departure. The Dybbuk, weakened and expelled, would enter this object rather than being free to wander and potentially possess someone else. The moment the spirit entered the object, the ritual demanded its immediate burial, often at a crossroads or in unconsecrated ground. The object would be interred with prayers of binding and protection, sealing the Dybbuk in a kind of spiritual prison where it could harm no one. The dangers of this process extended to everyone involved. For the possessed person, there was always risk that the exorcism might fail, that the Dybbuk might burrow deeper rather than emerge, or that the trauma of possession and exorcism might damage their mind beyond repair. Historical records include cases where individuals died during attempted exorcisms, their bodies apparently unable to survive the spiritual violence of the contest occurring within them. Others emerged physically intact, but psychologically shattered, unable to fully return to normal life after experiencing such invasion and violation. For the exorcist and the minion, the dangers were equally real within the belief system's logic. A Dybbuk, desperate to remain in its host, might lash out spiritually, attempting to possess one of the exorcists or attach itself to any person present who showed fear or spiritual weakness. This is why the minion was required, why each man had to maintain perfect focus on prayer and intention. Stories circulated in Hasidic communities of exorcists who later fell ill or died after confronting particularly powerful Dybbuks, their own spiritual defenses somehow breached during the combat. Whether these deaths resulted from supernatural causes or from the immense psychological and physical stress of conducting such rituals remains an open question that different interpreters answer differently. Modern psychological understanding offers alternative frameworks for these phenomena. Dissociative identity disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, and other conditions can produce symptoms remarkably similar to those attributed to Dybbuk possession: multiple voices, altered states of consciousness, knowledge or abilities the person does not normally possess, violent physical reactions, and profound personality changes. The interrogation process, in this view, might create space for traumatized aspects of the psyche to speak, to confess buried guilt or shame, and through this ritualized expression, to integrate back into the whole personality. The physical intensity of the exorcism, the community support represented by the minion, the authority figure of the rabbi, the dramatic arc from crisis through confrontation to resolution. All these elements align with what we now understand about trauma treatment and the power of ritual in psychological healing. The shofar blasts might induce altered states through their effect on breathing and nervous system arousal. The demand for naming and confession parallels therapeutic techniques that require explicit acknowledgement of buried truths. The exit through the toe and the burial of an object could serve as powerful metaphors made concrete, giving the afflicted person a physical narrative of separation from their suffering. Yet to reduce the Dybbuk exorcism entirely to psychology may miss something essential about how belief systems function and how communities create meaning around suffering. Within traditional communities that practice these rituals, the Dybbuk is real, spiritual combat is real, and the protocols developed over centuries represent genuine wisdom about confronting these forces. The internal logic of the system is consistent, comprehensive, and has provided explanatory power and healing for countless individuals across generations. Whether one interprets Dybbuk possession as literal spiritual invasion or as dramatic manifestation of psychological crisis, the ritual response demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human need. The afflicted person is taken seriously, their suffering acknowledged as real and significant. The community mobilizes in support rather than abandoning them. Authority figures risk themselves to provide help. A clear process with defined stages offers hope and structure in the midst of chaos. And ultimately, resolution is possible. The invading force can be expelled. The suffering can end. The persistence of Dybbuk exorcism into the modern era, even in communities with access to contemporary medical and psychological care, suggests that these rituals continue to serve needs that purely secular approaches may not fully address. They honor spiritual dimensions of human experience. They mobilize community resources, and they provide frameworks of meaning that connect individual suffering to larger cosmic narratives about good and evil, sin and redemption, exile and return. In the autumn of 1923, in the small Polish town of Wierzenia, near the border of what was once Prussia, a young Jewish woman named Hanna Lieberman began to change. It started subtly, as these things often do. A tremor in her hands during Sabbath dinner. A faraway look in her eyes that lasted hours. Her mother, Sarah, noticed first, the way mothers always do. But she kept quiet, hoping it would pass like a fever breaking in the night. Chana was 22 years old, unmarried but engaged to a merchant's son from Poznan. She worked in her father's fabric shop, a quiet girl known for her gentle disposition and skill with embroidery. Those who knew her described a soft-spoken young woman who blushed easily and never raised her voice, not even to the children who ran wild through the market streets. She had studied only what was expected of young women in her community, basic Hebrew prayers and domestic skills. She had never opened a page of Talmud, never sat with the scholars, never even listened at the door when her brothers studied late into the evening. But on a cold November morning, everything changed. The transformation began during morning prayers. Shana's father, Moshe, later told the rabbi that his daughter had been standing with the other women in the back of the synagogue when she suddenly went rigid. Her prayer book fell from her hands, landing with a sharp crack against the wooden floor that echoed through the sanctuary. Then came the voice. It emerged from her throat like something clawing its way up from deep underground, a man's voice, rough and desperate, speaking in a mix of Yiddish and Polish that no one had heard her use before. The voice said a name, Mordechai Finkel, a neighbor, a grain merchant who had disappeared 6 months earlier. Witnesses that morning, more than 30 people crowded into that small wooden synagogue, described what happened next with remarkable consistency. Even years later, when historians and folklorists came asking questions, Chana's face, they said, changed. Not metaphorically, not subtly, but visibly transformed before their eyes. Her delicate features seemed to harden, the bone structure appearing to shift beneath her skin. Her jaw became more pronounced, more angular. Her eyebrows thickened. One woman swore under oath that even the shape of Kana's nose appeared different, more prominent, more masculine. The voice that came from her spoke with authority and rage. It demanded justice. It claimed to be the soul of Mordecai Finkel, unable to rest because of violence, because of sin, because his body lay hidden in unconsecrated ground. The congregation erupted into chaos. Women screamed. Men backed away. Only the rabbi, an elderly scholar named Reb Zalman, approached the possessed girl, his hands trembling as he reached out. When he touched her shoulder, Chana, or the thing speaking through Chana, spun toward him with inhuman speed. The entity began to quote Talmud, specifically from Tractate Sanhedrin, the sections dealing with murder and capital punishment. The words poured out in perfect Aramaic, complex legal arguments that most of the men in that room had spent years studying to understand. The rabbi's face went pale. He stepped back, making the sign against the evil eye that his rational mind had long dismissed as superstition. The episode lasted nearly an hour before Chana collapsed, her body going limp like a puppet with cut strings. When she regained consciousness, she remembered nothing. She looked around at the frightened faces, confused and terrified by their terror. Her voice, when it returned, was her own again, soft and questioning. "What happened?" she asked. "What did I do?" But it was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, the possessions became more frequent and more violent. The entity that called itself Mordecai would seize control of Kana's body without warning. During dinner, she would suddenly lunge across the table, her face transforming, her voice dropping those several impossible octaves. She spoke of things she could not know, details about Mordecai's life, his business dealings, his secrets. She described his final moments with such visceral clarity that people wept and covered their ears. The physical transformations grew more extreme. During possession, witnesses reported that Shana's entire bearing changed. She sat differently, walked differently, moved with masculine gestures and aggressive postures completely foreign to her nature. Her hands, normally delicate and precise from years of needlework, would ball into fists and strike out at anyone who came near. It took 3 grown men to restrain her during the worst episodes, and even then, they described her strength as something beyond natural, beyond what a slender young woman should possess. The community of Wierzenia, Fewer than 200 Jewish families descended into terror. This was not folklore, not a story told by grandmothers to keep children in line. This was happening in their midst, visible and undeniable. People began to avoid the Lieberman house. Children were forbidden to walk past. Chana's engagement was quietly, shamefully, broken. The Lieberman family brought in specialists. First came Reb Yitzhak from Warsaw, a scholar known for his expertise in Kabbalah and mystical matters. He performed the traditional exorcism ritual, surrounding Chana with a minyan of 10 men, blowing the shofar, reciting the prescribed prayers. The Dybbuk, as they had come to call it, laughed. It laughed with Chana's mouth, but the sound was wrong, too deep, reverberating in a way that made the windows rattle. Reb Yitzhak's ritual failed completely. The spirit not only remained but seemed to strengthen, as if the attention fed it. 3 more exorcists came in the following month. Each failed. Each left shaken, questioning their understanding of the supernatural world. One rabbi from Lodz refused to speak of what he witnessed, packing his bags in the middle of the night and leaving without explanation or farewell. The possessions grew longer. At first, they lasted minutes or hours. By the spring of 1924, the Dybbuk would sometimes maintain control for days. Chana would disappear, and Mordecai would inhabit her body, pacing her room, demanding things, making pronouncements. The family had to lock her in her bedroom, not to imprison their daughter, but to protect the community from whatever she had become. During these extended possessions, the entity revealed more. It spoke of corruption in the town, of debts unpaid, of lies told. It embarrassed prominent citizens by exposing their secrets. The fear mixed with fascination. People were horrified, but also compelled. What else did the Dybbuk know? What other truths might it reveal? Then came the accusation that changed everything. On a Friday evening, in late May of 1924, as the sun set and Sabbath began, the Dybbuk seized control of Chana with such violence that she fell and struck her head, blood streaming from her temple. But the entity seemed not to notice or care about the body's pain. It stood, blood running down her face, and pointed directly at a man in the crowd gathered outside the Lieberman house. His name was Avram Kaminsky, a wealthy landowner respected in the community, a man above suspicion. The Dybbuk's voice erupted from Chana's throat with terrible clarity. "Murderer," it said. "He killed me. He struck me down for the money I carried. He buried me in the forest beyond the mill." The crowd went silent. Kaminsky's face drained of color. He began to protest, to deny, but something in his eyes betrayed him. The Dybbuk provided details, specific and verifiable detail. The location of the body. The weapon used, a wooden club. The amount of money stolen, 43 zloty and 16 groszy. It described Kaminsky's clothing that day, down to a torn button on his coat sleeve. The town's officials had no choice but to investigate. 3 days later, in exactly the location the Dybbuk described, they found remains. Dental records, what few existed, and personal effects confirmed the identity. Mordechai Finkel, dead for nearly a year, murdered. Under questioning, Avram Kaminsky held out for 6 hours before his conscience shattered. The confession poured out of him like poison from a wound. Yes, he had killed Mordecai. Yes, it was for money, for debts he could not otherwise pay. Yes, he had lived with it every day, the guilt eating him alive. He seemed almost relieved to finally tell the truth, as if the Dybbuk had not only accused him, but also freed him from the unbearable weight of his secret. Kaminsky's arrest should have ended it. The Dybbuk had achieved its purpose. Justice was served, but the possessions continued. If anything, they intensified. Chana spent more time absent from her own body than present. Her mother begged the rabbis to try again, to save her daughter before she was lost completely. The final exorcism took place in the summer of 1925, nearly 2 years after the possessions began. A great rabbi came from Lublin, a mystic named Reb Menachem, known throughout Poland for his spiritual power. He prepared for 3 days, fasting and praying, gathering a circle of 36 righteous men, a symbolic number in Jewish mysticism. They assembled in the synagogue at midnight, filling the space with candlelight and holy words. What happened that night has been described by the witnesses, but their accounts fragment, becoming inconsistent, as if the experience defied reliable memory. They all agree on certain points. The Dybbuk fought. It screamed through Chana's throat, not words but sounds of rage and despair. Her body convulsed with such force that several men struggled to hold her down. The rabbi chanted prayers that seemed to physically push against the entity, forcing it out inch by terrible inch. Then, at the climax, witnesses reported that Chana's mouth opened impossibly wide. Something, they said, something visible emerged. Some described it as smoke, others as shadow, a few as a shape almost human in its writhing. The temperature in the synagogue plummeted. Frost formed on the windows in the middle of summer. The candles flickered and nearly died. And then it was over. The presence vanished. Chana collapsed, truly empty for the first time in 2 years. But the girl who woke was not the girl who had been possessed. Chana's voice, when it returned, came only in whispers. She could not or would not speak above a faint rasp. Doctors examined her and found no physical damage to her vocal cords, no medical reason for the change. Yet the whisper remained, permanent. She refused to discuss the possession. Even her mother could not coax from her what it had been like, what she had experienced while the Dybbuk controlled her body. Had she been aware, trapped, and watching? Or had she been absent, gone somewhere else while an invader wore her flesh? No one knows. Chana never said. Some silences are too profound to break. She lived another 40 years, dying quietly, in 1965. She never married. She rarely left her house. Those who knew her in those later years described a woman haunted by something she could neither forget nor explain, carrying secrets that had carved themselves into her soul during those 2 years when she was not herself. The case remains one of the most thoroughly documented possessions in Eastern European Jewish history, recorded in rabbinical courts, in police records from Kaminsky's trial, in the testimonies of dozens of witnesses whose accounts align with eerie consistency. It raises questions that logic cannot answer. Was Chana truly possessed by a murdered man's soul? Or did something in the unconscious mind tap into hidden knowledge, into truths that should have remained buried? Whatever the answer, Chana Lieberman paid the price. She solved a murder, brought a killer to justice, and lost herself in the process. Some hauntings, it seems, leave marks that never fade. Some prices once paid can never be refunded. And some voices, once silenced by the inexplicable, choose to remain whispers forever. The questions remain, suspended in the silence between what we can explain and what we dare not accept. Across centuries of Dybbuk possession cases, certain facts refuse to dissolve under the light of rational inquiry. How did a 16-year-old girl in Warsaw in 1893 recite entire passages from the Zohar, texts she had never studied, in a dialect of Aramaic that scholars confirmed was accurate to 9th century Babylonian? How did the possessed baker's daughter in Krakow describe in perfect detail the interior of a synagogue in Vilna she had never visited, down to the specific pattern of cracks in its eastern wall, later confirmed by travelers who knew the building? These are not mere stories. They are documented puzzles that resist easy answers. Modern psychiatry offers explanations. Dissociative identity disorder, trauma-induced fragmentation, cryptomnesia, where forgotten memories surface as seemingly new knowledge. And yet, the cases that haunt the margins, the ones that scholars quietly set aside, speak in languages the possessed never heard, reveal secrets buried with the dead, and leave us standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. The Dybbuks have grown quiet in our modern age, but perhaps they are simply waiting, patient as death itself, for the moment when we open our mouths in the gathering dark. A Dybbuk enters through an open mouth, so the wise remain silent in the dark. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.